to Celluloid Chronicles, a historical movie podcast, and I'm Birdy, bringing you another Scenic Outtake episode. I am happy to be here, bring you some good after show information on Harriet. This movie was fantastic and fun to watch and learn about everything, but the historical accuracy, while plenty of it was really good, a lot of it was just missing or smushed together where I feel like it really shouldn't have been, but you know what? It's okay. We went over a lot of that in the main show. So just to give you some trigger warnings again, obviously this movie had depictions of slavery, abuse, murder, and violence against women and minorities, and that all is still relevant for our outtake information. So let's get into it. Today, I'm just bringing you a couple items. We're just going to discuss the legacy of Harriet Tubman and some more information on the Underground Railroad. So these couple things weren't really covered in the episode. I feel like we covered a good bit on the main episode. So I feel like this is really just tying up some loose ends here. But still pretty useful. So as we know, Harriet Tubman passed away of pneumonia on March 10th, 1913. And after that, glided gracefully and iconically into history. Even while she was alive, she was very well known and respected, which is something to definitely give to her credit. And she became an American icon by the 1980s. So about 100 years later, well, less than that, actually. She died in 1913. So by the late 1980s, only 70 years after her passing, I can do math, I swear, Tubman had become one of American history's most famous figures. She inspired all African Americans struggling for equality and civil rights, and she was kept and praised by leaders across the political spectrum. As I mentioned on the main episode, she inspired national parks and national monuments, and the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Monument and the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park, which are both in Maryland, and then there's one in Auburn where she was finally settled. The Salem Chapel in St. Catharines, Canada, where Tubman had previously worshipped, is now a National Historic Site in that country. So she's international. Obviously, her grave site is a historic site, and there's even a Harriet Tubman Museum in New Jersey. She's also been a great subject for artwork. Musicians such as Woody Guthrie, Wynton Marsalis, Walter Robinson have all written songs celebrating her. She's the subject of operas by Thea Musgrave, Nakira Okoye, Hilda Paredes, as well as plays by Carolyn Gage and a collaboration of Mae Miller and Willis Richardson. She's also the focus of novels by Elizabeth Cobbs, Marcy Heidish, Anne Parrish, and Bob the Drag Queen of all people, and is a character in novels by Terry Bisson, Nahahise Coates, and James McBride. Her life was first dramatized in 1963 in a television series, The Great Adventure, and she has been portrayed in TV productions such as The Good Lord Bird, Timeless, Underground, and A Woman Called Moses. And of course, finally, played by Cynthia Erivo in this film, the 2019 biographical Harriet. Other artists like Fern Cunningham, Jane DeDecker, Nina Cook John, Allison Sarr have all presented Tubman in sculptures. The first statue of Tubman in the region where she was born was unveiled in Salisbury, Maryland in 2009. She has been drawn or painted by numerous artists, including Romare Bearden, Aaron Douglas, William Johnson, Jacob Lawrence, and Faith Ringgold. In 1978, she became the first African-American woman honored on a U.S. postage stamp. She appeared on a second stamp in 1995. And since 2016, there have been plans to add a portrait of Tubman to the front of the $20 bill, moving the portrait of President Andrew Jackson, who was a slaveholder, to the back of the bill. In 2024, the United States Mint issued 3 Harriet Tubman commemorative coins. Each coin depicts her at a different stage of her life. Now, as for that $20 bill, there are still plans for it to come out in around 2030. Of course, it has been delayed during the current administration. I wonder why. How interesting. But yes, there are still efforts to have her start appearing on the $20 bill, which would be amazing. And I could see it happening either way. We'll see in a few years if that happens. Today, we are right now in 2026. So in 4 years, let's see if we get that new $20 bill. And then obviously dozens of schools, streets, highways, church groups, social organizations, and government agencies have been named after Tubman. In 1944, the United States Maritime Commission launched the SS Harriet Tubman, its first Liberty ship named for a Black woman. On November 11, 2024, Tubman was posthumously commissioned as a 1-star general, a brigadier general in the Maryland Army National Guard in recognition of her military service during the Civil War. Oh, so that did not come out in the news, or at least that I hadn't heard. It is It is of note that Harriet did hope to become literate and write down her own memoirs during her life, but she was never able to. I think she was a little busy. I think she might have been just a tad busy. Instead, she did authorize Sarah Hopkins Bradford, to combine Tubman's personal recollections, journalistic accounts, and letters from Tubman's friends and supporters to create Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman in 1868. It is now criticized by modern biographers for its artistic license and highly subjective point of view. But the book nevertheless provides insight into Tubman's own view of her experiences, which I feel is pretty damn important. It's supposed to be her biography. It is her point of view. I don't know. In 1886, at Tubman's request, Bradford re-released a rewritten volume of Harriet, the Moses of Her People. In both volumes, Harriet Tubman is hailed as a latter-day Joan of Arc. The revision took a more moralistic and literary tone than the prior work, changed many of the event descriptions from first to third person, and rearranged depictions of events in chronological order. A final revision in 1901 added an appendix with more stories about Tubman's life. Excellent. The first full biography of Tubman to be published after Bradford's was Earl Conrad's Harriet Tubman in 1943. Conrad experienced great difficulty in finding a publisher. The search took 4 years and endured disdain and contempt for his efforts to construct a more objective, detailed account of Tubman's life for adults. Several highly dramatized versions of Tubman's life had been written for children, and many more came later, but Conrad wrote in an academic style. Though she was a popular historical figure, another book-length biography based on original scholarship did not appear for another 60 years when Jean Humes published a close reading of Tubman's life stories in 2003. Kate Clifford Larson and Catherine Clinton both published their biographies soon after in 2004. Historian Milton Cernet's 2007 book, Harriet Tubman, Myth, Memory, and History, discusses the major biographies of Tubman up to that time. In 2024, historian Etta Fields Black published Combahee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom during the Civil War, which shed new light on Tubman's military service, and it was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for History. In the years after her death in 1913, up until today, Harriet Tubman has served as a physical manifestation of the liberation and emancipation of slavery for many. On the bicentennial of her birth, this dynamic woman of many trades continues to be revered as an American hero and a symbol of freedom. Some of this was written, again, around the bicentennial of her birth, and these sources will be in the show notes. But I am going to move on to the Underground Railroad itself. Now, obviously, this will not be a super deep dive. I'm sure there's plenty of more scholarly and detailed sources if you want those. For now, we are going to just kind of discuss some highlights. So to give a little bit of a timeline, I found this part interesting because the Underground Railroad was more of a decentralized network that actually operated from the late 1700s until 1865. So like it was operating for like 80 years, probably even longer, honestly, for, early escaped slaves. So like, I didn't know that. And I think that's a part that's kind of glossed over, is that this network, the Underground Railroad, was long running. And I just find that so beautiful, with obviously ebbs and flows in its usage. But between that time, the Underground Railroad roughly helped over 100,000 enslaved people escape to the North in Canada, especially through like the early Quaker efforts that kind of kicked it off in the 1780s. And then the expansion of organized routes in the 1820s and 1830s. And then obviously the increase in danger due to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act and its dissolution upon the 13th Amendment, when it wasn't needed anymore. Yay, amazing when something dies because it's actually isn't needed anymore. So I'm going to just go over a real light timeline of the Underground Railroad, just for like, sometimes it's good to like kind of visualize it out. So in the 1780s was when Northern abolitionist societies began organizing early safe house networks. And then in the 1790s, Quaker Isaac T. Hopper and the Philadelphia African Americans Pioneer Association helped runaway slaves. In 1808, the United States officially outlawed the African slave trade, but domestic slavery still grew. Isn't that interesting? Then in 1820, the Quakers Vestal and Levi Coffin established the early long distance routes. And in 1827, there's the Freedom's Journal, the first Black-owned newspaper, which began publication. And if I'm remembering correctly, kind of had hidden notes in it for people that were helping escaped slaves. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison began publishing the abolitionist paper, The Liberator. And then in 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded in Philadelphia, which we see in the movie. Well, not the founding, but it existing. Josiah Henson established the Dawn Institute in Ontario, Canada for refugees in 1841. And then in 1847, William Still started aiding fugitives for the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. And then in 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped slavery and using the Underground Railroad and returned to become the most famous conductor. And then 1850, we have the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act. 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act sparked the violent conflict over the expansion of slavery. 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision denies citizenship to African Americans and validates slavery in territories. And then the Civil War came. 1861, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. 1865, the 13th Amendment passes, abolishing slavery and officially ending the Underground Railroad. So that's the outline there. Really, very simplified, but I thought it was nice to put it kind of like, especially those early bits, because everyone thinks of the Civil War when they think of the Underground Railroad. But, that's something I think I'll have to dive into a little more myself, is like, well, what about those 80 years before? So it's kind of cool. Then I got some note. Now I'll just do some like fun fact of things that I noted as I was researching this bit. Slaves have been known to escape from slavery as early as the 16th century, so from the beginning. And obviously those escapes would have been unaided. Then in the 1780s, those networks of safe houses began to develop among the abolitionist societies. So it should never be thought that slaves weren't escaping on their own throughout this entire time. They never, ever, ever wanted to be enslaved. I don't care what you say. Just to give an idea, the routes themselves did follow natural and man-made modes of transportation. So, you got rivers, canals, bays, the Atlantic coast, ferries, river crossings, roads, and trails. Locations usually were close to ports, free territories, and international boundaries, which prompted many of the escapes. So like in the movie, they kind of discuss, and in some of my research, it kind of noted how slaves that lived kind of on the southern border, so they were in the slave side, like Maryland, where Harriet Tubman was, or you got Virginia or North Carolina, close Tennessee, that closer to the Mason-Dixon line. It was easier for them because they could cross over. There's also a lot more rivers and different things like that. The more further south into the quote unquote deep south you go, you're further away from that border. So you have to cover more enemy territory basically in order to escape into free territory. And that's why they talked about like Harriet Tubman's sisters, her 3 sisters that were taken and sent south. They were actually sent into the deeper south, and that's why they kind of disappeared. It was kind of like an unspoken death sentence or an unspoken you will be never seen again. And kind of the data kind of backs that up, that a lot the deeper south you look into that history, the less you're able to find anything on slaves that existed at that time. And it was just harder to find freedom. It was kind of interesting on that. So the network itself, primarily the work of free and enslaved African Americans, but assisted by abolitionists and others sympathetic to the cause of the escapees. The slaves who risked capture and those who aided them were collectively referred to as passengers and conductors of the railroad, respectively. Various other routes led to Mexico, which I didn't know originally, but Mexico, where slavery had also been abolished, and to the islands in the Caribbean that were not part of the slave trade. So there was an earlier escape route that ran south toward Florida, which during the late 17th century was still part of Spanish possession, except for a small 20-year period in between 1763 and 1783. But that only existed, obviously, till the late 17th century, approximately 1790, but that was a route during that time. During the American Civil War, freedom seekers did escape to the Union lines in the South to obtain their freedom. One estimate suggests that by 1850, approximately that 100,000 slaves had escaped to freedom via that network. And then during the Civil War, which is fun to note, at least according to Professor Blaine Hudson in Pan-African Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Louisville, 500,000, so 500,000 more African Americans had self-emancipated from slavery on the Underground Railroad during the war. So if you're curious about the name itself, Eric Foner wrote that the term was perhaps first used by a Washington newspaper in 1839, quoting a young slave hoping to escape bondage via a railroad that went underground all the way to Boston. Dr. Robert Clemens Smedley wrote that following slave catchers' failed searches and lost traces of fugitives as far south as Columbia, Pennsylvania, they declared in bewilderment that there must be an underground railroad somewhere, giving origin to the term. Scott Shane wrote that the first documented use of the term was in an article written by Thomas Smallwood in August 10th, 1842 edition of Tocsin of Liberty, Tocsin of Liberty, an abolitionist newspaper published in Albany, New York. He also wrote that the 1879 book, Sketches in the History of the Underground Railroad, said that the phrase was mentioned in an 1839 Washington newspaper article, and the book's author said 40 years later he had quoted the article from memory as closely as he could. So there's some back and forth on that, but it was there, and I think trains were a big thing at that time in, trains. I like trains, and I'm sure they all liked trains. Oh my God. All right. What else do we got here? It is good to note that majority of freedom seekers that escaped from slavery did not have help from any abolitionists or other white folk like you see in the movie. I mean, yes, it was there, but many of these escapes were unaided. A large majority of the escape routes for freedom seekers came through maroon communities. These maroon, M-A-R-O-O-N, were hidden places places, such as wetlands or marshes, where escaped slaves established their own independent communities. And this isn't talked about too much, but examples of maroon communities in the United States include the Black Seminole communities in Florida, as well as groups that lived in the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia and in the Okefenokee Swamp of Georgia and Florida, among others. In 1780s, Louisiana had a maroon community in the bayous of St. Malo. The leader of the St. Malo maroon community was Jean St. Malo, a freedom seeker who escaped to live among other runaways in swamps and bayous in that area. The population of Maroons was 50, and the Spanish colonial government broke up the community on June 19th, 1784, and Jean St. Malo was executed. Colonial South Carolina had a number of Maroon settlements in its marshland regions in the Low Country and near rivers. Maroons in South Carolina fought to maintain their freedom and prevent enslavement in Ashepu in 1816, Williamsburg County in 1819, and Georgetown in 1820. And Jacksonboro in 1822, and Marion in 1861. Historian Herbert Aptheker found evidence that 50 Maroon communities existed in the United States between 1672 and 1864. The history of Maroons showed how the enslaved resisted enslavement by living in free, independent settlements. Historical archaeologist Dan Sayre says that the historians downplay the importance of these settlements and place valor in the white involvement in the Underground Railroad, which he argues shows a racial bias, indicating a reluctance to acknowledge the strength of Black resistance and initiative. So I could go on and on forever about this. I had not learned about these communities, and I need to know more, and I think you should too, because this is something that's not talked about, was not talked about when I went to school, and it was not talked about in the movie, and I've never heard about it, and I wonder if this is where the term being marooned comes from. So yes, I did take a quick look, and yes, to be marooned does derive from the term maroon, referring to fugitives, to Cimarroons, and to Black Africans that went out into the wild to escape slavery. You know, it entered the English language around 1590s from the French adjective marron, meaning feral or fugitive. So there's a couple origins there, but that's kind of where it came from. So yeah, specifically the Cuban philologist Jose Juan Aram has traced the origins of the word maroon further than even the Spanish cimarron, used first in Hispaniola to refer to feral cattle, then to Indian slaves who escaped to the hills, and by the 1530s to African slaves who did the same. He proposes that the American Spanish word derives ultimately from the Arawakan root word cimarabo, construed as fugitive by the Taino people native to the island. And yes, escaped slaves did also find routes to Native American lands. Indigenous peoples of North America assisted and did protect enslaved Africans journeying to freedom. However, not all communities were accepting of freedom seekers, some of whom they enslaved themselves or returned to their former enslavers, just like any types of humans. Overall, they definitely helped more than the other. In the 18th and 19th centuries, in the areas around the Chesapeake Bay and Delaware, the Nanticoke people hid freedom seekers in their villages. The Nanticoke people lived in small villages near the Pocomoke River. The river rises in several forks in the Great Cypress Swamp in southern Delaware, and freedom seekers were able to hide in the swamp. Water rushed off the scent of their enslavement and made it difficult for dogs to track their scent. And as early as the 18th century, mixed blood communities were formed. In Maryland, freedom seekers escaped to Shawnee villages located along the Potomac River. Slaveholders in Virginia and Maryland filed numerous complaints and court petitions against the Shawnee and Nanticoke people for hiding freedom seekers in their villages. Ottawa people also accepted freedom seekers, and the Ottawa transferred the runaways to the Ojibwe, who escorted them to Canada. Some enslaved people who escaped slavery and fled to Native American villages stayed in those communities. White pioneers who traveled to Kentucky and the Ohio Territory saw, quote-unquote, Black Shawnees living with indigenous people in the Trans-Appalachian West. During the colonial era in New Spain and in the Seminole Nation in Florida, African Americans and indigenous marriages occurred often. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some freedom seekers did go, if they couldn't go north, they went south. They did try Florida first, at least until they couldn't. And Manifest Destiny stole that from them. And as for Florida again, after King Charles II of Spain proclaimed Spanish Florida a safe haven for escaped slaves from British North America, they began escaping to Florida by the hundreds, from as far as New York. And the Spanish established Fort Mose for free blacks in the St. Augustine area in 1738, which led to that community being a very highly concentrated African American community for centuries, because that name might seem familiar because that's eventually where Ray Charles was born into the black communities there. Yeah, so a little interesting tie-in there. By the early 1800s, Texas slowly became a kind of gate to freedom as well. In 1806 specifically, some enslaved people arrived at the Stone Fort in Nacogdoches, Texas, which at that time, I believe, was still Spanish-Mexican territory, and they were seeking freedom. They arrived with a forged passport from a Kentucky judge. I need to know more about this. The Spanish refused to return them back to the United States, and more freedom seekers traveled through Texas the following year. Enslaved people were emancipated by crossing the border from the United States into Mexico, which was a Spanish colony, into the 19th century. During the War of 1812, the U.S. Army General Andrew Jackson, here he is again, invaded Spanish Florida in part because enslaved people had started running away from plantations in the Carolinas and Georgia to Florida. Some of the runaways joined the Black Seminoles, who later moved to Mexico. Mexico sent signals on its position against slavery. Sometimes it allowed enslaved people to be returned to slavery, and it allowed Americans to move into Spanish territorial property in order to populate the North, where Americans would then establish cotton plantations, bringing enslaved people to work on the land. So it was kind of a 50-50 there. In 1829, Mexican President Vicente Guerrero, who was a mixed-race black man, formally abolished slavery in Mexico. Freedom seekers from southern plantations in the Deep South, particularly from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, escaped slavery and headed for Mexico. At that time, Texas was part of Mexico. So as I mentioned before, the Texas Revolution, initiated in part to legalize slavery, resulted in the formation of the Republic of Texas in 1836. Following the Battle of San Jacinto, there were some enslaved people who withdrew from the Houston area with the Mexican army, seeing troops as a means to escape slavery. When Texas joined the Union in 1845, it was a slave state, and the Rio Grande became the international border with Mexico. Pressure between the free and slave states deepened as Mexico abolished slavery and Western states joined the Union as free states. Here's another interesting fact on what are known as Americans. The Americans were formerly enslaved black Americans that escaped slavery and joined the British military's all-black unit of colonial Marines during the War of 1812. When the war ended, they were taken to numerous British colonies to live as free people. About 700 colonial Marines were taken to Trinidad in the Caribbean. Although slavery was legal in Trinidad, they were guaranteed protection under Commander Robert Mitchell. The formerly black Americans called themselves Americans and started new lives in Trinidad in 6 company villages in the southern part of the island. The Trinidadian government provided the Americans with food, rations, clothing, and tools needed to build their homes, and they grew their own food of corn, pumpkin, plantain, and rice. And obviously, many of the routes that they took changed, formed new ones as history changed and happened throughout the century. And then finally, after being around for 80 years, and ending with the Civil War, and then, becoming American history and becoming, today, many children might even think of as almost folklore. There's a lot of myth busting and stuff that quilt designs were used to signal and direct enslaved people to escape routes. It's very disputed. I think it comes from a 1980 children's book, but it's a fun one. There's also some popular songs, spirituals, and other songs such as as steal away or follow the drinking gourd, they say contained coded information, helped individuals navigate the railroad. There's little evidence really to support that, but scholars do believe that some slave songs certainly expressed hope for deliverance and sorrows. And, like we saw in the movie, that, they were used as kind of just ways to talk to other people on the plantation, but they did not literally help runaway slaves. But the Underground Railroad did inspire cultural works. For example, Song of the Free, written in 1860. It's about a man fleeing slavery in Tennessee, was composed to the tune of Oh, Susanna. And every stanza ends with a reference to Canada as the land where colored men are free. Slavery in Upper Canada, which is now Ontario, was outlawed in 1793. And in 1819, John Robinson, the Attorney General of Upper Canada, declared that by residing in Canada, Black residents were set free and that Canadian courts would protect their freedom. But yeah, so there was a lot of folklore on that, and all the way to today. I mean, I remember, I believe the Henry Ford Museum, and they had a showcase on the Underground Railroad and a really cool area where they talked about the reverse Underground Railroad, where there was actually incidences of enslaved people were escaping in order to fill those roles. Some people would go and fleed Black people and take them back to plantations in the South to enslave them. But we learned a little bit about that. Yeah, so it's very important and it's fascinating and definitely something I would even want to dive even more into. But I hope you all enjoyed this. I'm trying to keep it a little shorter today, and I'm really excited to get to our next movie. Yes, so you'll see all the sources in the show notes. I've got, obviously Wikipedia, my friend, timeline, finding the American Anti-Slavery Society, the MPS.org, significant events of the Underground Railroad, timeline Underground Railroad and the 13th Amendment. I've got plenty to put in there, so please check those out. Otherwise, thank you for listening to Celluloid Chronicles, a historical movie podcast. Please like and subscribe to us wherever you listen, and we hope you join us again soon. And always remember, live like you're making history.